impressed. It's a trap, right? It's not science and cocktails. It's cocktails and science. And I've had a few of those. So. All right, consciousness. So, one starting point for this is to imagine that you're in this beautiful Hello bus, which is known throughout the world through the internet. And you're standing there and you're seeing the beautiful color of the hyacinths, and you're smelling their scent, and you're feeling some humidity in the air, and your skin is bathed by the sun rays. And all of these sensations will maybe result in emotion. You will feel good to be there. And maybe you also have thoughts. You're thinking, well, it's really cool to be here, it's a beautiful place. And all these sensations, emotions, and thoughts make up, define your presence to the world at that particular point in time. It feels like something for you to be there at that moment in time, and that's what we call consciousness. It's the whole of your mental life at some point in time. And we know that all that mental stuff comes from the biological activity of the brain. And we know that the brain is this immensely complex object. There's about 88 billion neurons. People used to think it was closer to 100 billion, but it turns out to be 88 billion neurons. And each of those neurons has about 10,000 connections with other neurons. So it's a massively complex network. And everything that happens in there defines what happens in your mind. There's no mental event that isn't also a biological event taking place in your body, but for the best part of it in your brain. And understanding the connection between this biological activity and your mental states is a problem that is difficult enough that many people now take it to be on a par with other big issues in the sciences, such as the origins of the universe or the origins of life. Now, consciousness for a long while has been in the hands of philosophers. So here you have John Searle, who's a well-known American philosopher of mind. I took a picture of him while he was in a slightly altered state of consciousness there too. And what he says is that consciousness consists of those states of sensation, or feeling, or awareness, which begin in the morning when we awake from a dreamless sleep and continue throughout the day until we fall into a coma, or die, or fall asleep again, or otherwise become unconscious. Now, the more scientifically oriented amongst you will say, well, what a bullshit definition this is. This can only come from a philosopher. But it captures the fact that whenever we open our eyes, well, there you go. You have all these sensations, emotions, and thoughts combining and shaping your presence to the world, and that's what it is. It's an immediate datum of experience for any human being. Now, the reality, though, is that nobody has any idea how the brain produces consciousness. That's why it's such a big issue. Nobody knows what it's like to be a bat, chasing insects at dusk using a system to perceive space from which sonar was inspired from. Nobody knows what it's like to be a bat because consciousness is a private phenomenon. I don't know what's going through your minds right now. Hopefully you're listening to me or sipping on your cocktail. But I don't know, I have to ask you. And likewise, I don't know what's going on in the mind of a bat. Presumably, there is something it is like to be a bat. But I have no access to this. Consciousness is a private phenomenon. And Nagel's point, Nagel is the philosopher who titled his paper, What is it like to be a bat? And what a great title it is. His point was to say, well, we could know whatever there is to know about the brain of a bat, we will never know what it feels like to be a bat. And that's the difficulty with the study of consciousness. It is so difficult that yet another American philosopher, actually he's from Australia, he's a good friend, he looks like a rock star, and he behaves like one too, but he's a really good philosopher, and this is David Chalmers, and he called the problem of consciousness the hard problem. And what he means by that is explained in this little passage. He says, this is 1996, so already 20 years ago, that numerous books and articles dedicated to consciousness have appeared recently, and one might think that there is progress, but in reality these works have ignored the hard problem. Often they concern what one might call the easy problems of consciousness. How does the brain process information? How does it integrate information? How do we produce verbal reports on our mental states? These questions, says Chalmers, are interesting, but answering them does not solve the hard problem. Why is it the case that information processing is accompanied by subjective experience, by what it feels like? Now, what he calls the easy problems of consciousness are all the problems that the cognitive neurosciences worry about. Things like, how do we read? How do we perceive the visual world? How does audition works? How do we program our actions? How can I stand up without thinking about it? How do I learn about stuff? All of these problems, he says, are problems that are easy in the sense that we can understand how, give it another 50 years, maybe a century, we will get a complete picture of the visual system, etc., etc. Easy problems, as illustrated here, are also problems that we share with AI. People design robots now that can navigate any sort of terrain. This was an immensely difficult problem 20 years ago. We have robots that have appropriate social interactions with human beings. We have AI systems that are capable of competing with humans in real time and win the competition. Think of AlphaGo, for instance, the work of DeepMind. We have systems that can not only recognize faces, like on your iPhone, but also decide whether the person is a man, a woman, a young person, and so on and so forth. All of this is great, but it's all about intelligence. It's not about consciousness. Consciousness is not about intelligence. All of this stuff goes on without any awareness of what's going on. Here's another situation. This is the carnivorous plant Dionea muscipula, the Venus trap. And you can see this insect unwittingly walking on the leaves of the plant, and when he has hit 3 of the little hairs, then the trap closes. Is the plant morally responsible for the death of the insect? Well, no, because it couldn't have done otherwise. It's a mechanical process. The leaves close and the insect dies. This goes on without awareness as well, even though the plant has great sensitivity to its world, to its environment, and it looks like it's able to make decisions of some kind. But it's not aware of its own existence. It doesn't know that it's doing this, it's just doing it for reasons that have been set up by evolution. There's lots of interesting debates about animal cognition. Here is an example of a crow who's holding a metal stick in its beak, and it's trying to get out of this glass tube a little container with a sort of an attachment, and of course it doesn't succeed, but as you will see, he will soon figure it out, and so he sticks the stick into the base of this tube, bends it, and makes a hook. And with the hook, he's going to be able to get that little container in which there's a nut that he would like to eat, and eat the damn nut. He's really clever. Is he conscious? That's a question we can ask. We have no way of finding out because we cannot ask the crow, well, tell me, what did it feel like for you? Because it doesn't have language. And people's intuitions about which animals beyond humans are conscious differ very much. Some people would say, yes, so obviously there is something it is like for the crow to be the crow doing this. Other people would say no. Other people would say even human infants are not conscious. My intuitions tell me the crow is conscious. There is something like it is for the crow to be this crow in this particular point in time. But what about a slug? You think slugs are conscious? Well, some of you may say yes, other people may say no. Earthworms, bacteria, where do you stop? There's no good criterion at this point. People's thoughts about the relationships between the mind and the body are also sometimes very different. We keep thinking of the mind as something separate from the body. Here's the results of a survey carried out in a non-religious university in the UK a few years ago. And so this was students on this campus, and they were asked to answer, well, to mark their agreement or not with propositions like the mind and the brain are two separate things. 67% of people say yes. The mind is fundamentally physical. 64% of people say no. Some spiritual part of us survives death. 70% of people say yes. Each of us has a soul which is separate from the body. 65% of people agree with this. This is very different than the sorts of answers you would get from neuroscientists. And it sort of suggests, even in the scientific community, that we keep thinking of brain and body as completely separate things. How do you measure consciousness? This is a major difficulty when studying consciousness. Here you have again David Chalmers at a conference in 1996, and he's holding a hairdryer next to his head, and he laments the fact that we do not have a consciousness meter, a device that you could stick on people's head and let us figure out what is going on in their minds. That's the difficulty with the study of consciousness from a scientific perspective. It is that you have to combine subjective and objective data. Physicists, like the guys running this science and cocktails, or I should say cocktails and science meeting, they use objective data. Anybody can replicate any experiment. In psychology, there's also objective data. You can observe your behavior, I can measure the state of your brain, but if you study consciousness, you always end up to have to ask people, what did you see? What did you not see? What do you think is going on? These are subjective data. They come from an individual's perspective. They're private data. They're not quantifiable in the way that scientists like data to be. And consciousness plays tricks on us. There's many instances of these tricks. Here's one. You should see movement in this picture. The circles should rotate. Maybe it doesn't work because of the screen, but you can print this out on a piece of paper and it works great. You see movement all over the place, but of course it's a static stimulus that induces movement in your mind. So now there's movement in your mind, but there's no movement on the outside world. It's a sort of hallucination. Here's another example of a trick. Something is changing in this picture, which actually is not a picture, it's a movie. It's a movie that takes about 12 seconds to loop back and forth. We're not going to play the game too long. I'll tell you what is changing. It's the entire facial expression of the central guy, who goes from a neutral expression to an expression where he's frankly smiling. This is called change blindness, because now there's something out there that you simply fail to see. Why is that the case? Have you seen it? You'll see it now. You can start it again so you can see it's changing now that you know where it is. You're paying full attention. This is a very visible stimulus. Once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. Why is it the case that we fail to perceive this? And I can loop back and forth about 30 or 40 times. Change blindness. Here's another example that involves attention. There's actually 12 black dots at the intersections in this picture. If you look at this, normally, maybe it works better at the back than in the front. You should only be able to see 3 or 4 dots at the same time, and they keep changing. Nothing is changing. It's again a static picture with 12 dots. There's 1 dot at every intersection. But because of processes that we do not fully understand yet, you can only see 3 or 4 of those dots at the same time. This is the best trick, I think. I love this illusion. It's from Adelson. A and B are exactly the same shade of gray. This is really hard to believe, right? You don't believe your eyes right now. But they are exactly the same shade of gray. Why do we see them so differently? There's two things. One is top-down knowledge. You know how these sorts of objects are structured, playboards with alternating square colors, so you expect B to be lighter than the surrounding squares. And then there's a bottom-up factor, which is the fact that B sits in the shade projected by the cylinder, so your brain automatically lightens it up. That's why you see a white sheet of paper as being white, even though it's dusk or dawn or noon, etc., etc. It's called color consistency. But what a trick, right? If I remove all these contextual cues, then you see that we're exactly the same shade of gray. So we see things that are not there. We fail to see things that are there. We do not see everything, but we think we do. This is called change blindness, by the way. We see differences where there are none. And so consciousness is a form of hallucination of reality. And my good friend Anil Seth had a great formula about this. He says, we're all hallucinating all the time. When we agree about our hallucinations, well, that's what we call reality. That's really cool. Anyway, so that makes it so that consciousness is a sort of mystery. It remains a mystery today. It's been long taken to be impossible to study from a scientific point of view. We saw what Dennett, Nagel, and Chalmers had to say about it, and it became an object of scientific inquiry about 20 years ago when brain imaging came onto the scene. I must say, we haven't made that big of a progress with the arrival of brain imaging in studying consciousness. We understand all sorts of things about which brain regions get active when people are conscious versus when they're not conscious of something. But it opened up the idea that we could now go from brain activity to mental states in one go, so to speak, without going through behavior, that we could correlate what goes on in the brain and what goes on in mental life. Whether that will prove to be the road to a full understanding of consciousness remains to be seen, but it's clear that this has changed the game in terms of taking the problem of consciousness away from philosophers and putting it into the hands of empirical scientists. All right. So, next, I want to tell you that consciousness is not a single thing. We think of phenomenal experience, what it's like to be you at some point in time, as consciousness, but in fact, it has different aspects that can be distinguished from each other and dissociated from each other. There's at least 3 dimensions. One is the difference between perceptual awareness, self-awareness, and awareness of other people. The second is a distinction between what it's like, the phenomenal qualities of conscious states and what they can do. And the third is a distinction between level of consciousness and contents of consciousness. And I'll begin with that. So the notion of level of consciousness is intransitive. It just refers to the state of wakefulness. The notion of contents of consciousness, on the other hand, is transitive and refers to what goes on through your mind when you are aware of some state of affairs. This is always about something. And interestingly, these two aspects can dissociate. So when you dream, when you're sleeping, and you have a dream, there is something it is like for you to have that dream. But you're unconscious because you're sleeping. And so levels, you're unconscious, but contents, you're conscious because you experience something. And at the opposite end, in vegetative state patients, these people, these patients who suffer from lesions typically in the cerebral trunk that make them close to coma, they keep having sleep-wake cycles, but there's nobody home. You cannot interact with them, they cannot follow commands. It looks like the mind is empty. My good friend Stephen Lorrace, who did a Cocktails and Science talk last year, I think, is a worldwide authority on this matter. And he distinguishes between normal consciousness, where both level and contents are up, coma, none of them are there, vegetative state, where people still have sleep-wake cycles, but there's no contents anymore, minimally conscious state, basically the same, but the contents fluctuate. Sometimes you can interact with the patient. And then there's this very special syndrome called locked in, where people look like they're in vegetative state, but as it turns out, they're just almost completely paralyzed. The French journalist Beaubry wrote a book about this called Le Scaphandre et le Papillon. Typically, these patients keep the use of one eyelid. He used this one eyelid to dictate to his assistant the entire book. And then this was turned into a movie narrating his experience of being in that state. It's a stunning state of awareness, because these patients are fully conscious, except they can't move and they cannot speak and interact with other people. So you can place this on a graph showing levels here, contents there. You have coma at one end, general anesthesia, and then on the other end, conscious wakefulness, and all these intermediate states defining these interactions between levels and contents. Here's a patient suffering from, well, he looks like he suffers from a vegetative state syndrome, but as you'll see, he's actually a locked-in patient, because he can use his eyes to control a mouse on a computer screen and compose emails. The person is fully conscious. Lorrace and Owen showed that you can interact with these patients using MRI. So you place the patient in a scanner, and you tell them, I'm going to ask you questions. If you want to answer yes, then you imagine playing tennis. If you want to answer no, then you imagine moving about your house. And as it turns out, this activates very specific regions of the brain, which you can track using real-time magnetic resonance imaging. And by doing this, they show that it was possible to communicate with these patients. You can ask them questions. They imagine playing tennis. If they want to answer yes, they imagine moving about their house. If they want to answer no. This is crucially important because, as it turns out, there's about 40% of patients assumed to be in a vegetative state, which is completely unresponsive, who actually are in a locked-in syndrome. But of course, you want to treat those patients completely differently. One class of patients is completely unaware of what's going on. The other class is fully aware of what's going on. So studying consciousness has important clinical implications. Second distinction, perceptual awareness versus self-awareness versus awareness of other people's mental states. I don't want to say much about this, but consciousness, the awareness I have of the world surrounding me is not the same thing as self-consciousness, and self-consciousness is not the same thing as what people call theory of mind. That is the ability that I have to attribute mental states and understand the mental states of other people. And there's complex relationships between these three aspects of consciousness: perceptual awareness, self-awareness, and the awareness of the mental states of other people. One good example of how these aspects can be dissociated is autism, which is a pathology that involves specifically difficulties in social interactions. But autistic people seem to keep a perfectly normal awareness of themselves as agents. So you have difficulties understanding other people's minds while keeping an ability to understand yourself. Developmentally, it's also very interesting to ask, what is the sequence? What comes first? Do we first become aware of the world, and then we become aware of ourselves? and then we finally get to be able to get something about what other people's minds are like? Or is it the reverse? So one causal flow goes this way, but some people are suggesting, no, it begins with theory of mind. The first thing I try to do as a baby is try to figure out what the consequences of the actions I direct towards other people are. That's the beginning. Then I get a model of what it's like to be an agent. I get a model of what it's like to be someone if I understand the mental states of other people, and I can apply that to myself. And that gives me a way of becoming aware of the world. Many questions arise about self-awareness. Here's this young chimp, and
he's not sure what to make of it.
He's trying to figure out what is this other chimp in the mirror.
Erect fur is usually a sign of fear or anger.
No, this is made for television, right? It takes longer.
But his fear is
But
soon
initially,
replaced by
he displays
curiosity.
these vindictive behaviors, and then he finally gets to understand that, this thing moving in the mirror is a reflection of himself. And so he has some sense. He has some sense of his own existence. The only test for self-awareness is called a mirror test. So you paint a mark on the forehead of an animal, anesthetized, so he doesn't feel anything, and then you place him in front of a mirror and you see what happens. And you conclude to self-awareness if he starts directing behaviors towards that spot. Because he then realizes that this spot is not him, it's not part of his body, so he wonders what it is. And there's a very interesting collection of species that exhibit self-awareness, and nobody understands why it is those species and not other species. So some monkeys, not all of them, chimps, orangutans, but not gorillas, dolphins, elephants, but not dogs, not cats. It's strange, nobody gets it. Big problem. Okay, final distinction, experience versus function. This is the thing that interests philosophers most. There's two senses of awareness that philosophers distinguish, but also empirical scientists. One is called access consciousness, and it refers to the fact that conscious representations are globally available in the brain in a way that unconscious representations are not. By this, they mean that once something is conscious, once you are conscious of something, you can do things with this representation. You can talk about it, you can share it with other people, you can use it as a goal. If you know that you're hungry, for instance, you can say, well, gee, I'm hungry. You can go find some food and so on and so forth. If the hunger was somehow unconscious, that information that your stomach is suffering wouldn't be available for many systems in the brain to be used and govern your behavior. But this is nothing about what it feels like to be hungry. And that's called phenomenal consciousness. Conscious representations are experienced. They form the contents of subjective experience. It feels like something for you to be hungry. Now you can imagine an AI system, for instance, that goes recharge its batteries when something senses that these batteries are empty. That would be access consciousness. But you wouldn't say, well, the robot who goes to recharge its batteries actually feels hungry for energy. It doesn't feel anything because it's a machine, and machines don't feel, or computers don't feel anything so far. That's the difference. Whether it can make you do stuff, access consciousness, or whether it feels like something. And there's big debates about the connection between these two aspects of consciousness. Some people say, well, you can have phenomenal awareness without access awareness. Ned Block, the philosopher who coined this distinction, always gives orgasm as an example of a purely phenomenal state. It feels like something to have an orgasm, but it doesn't play any function. That's his point anyway. Other people would say, well, no, access and experience always go together. So it's a complex philosophical debate that has to do in part with attention. There's many different ideas about how attention plays a role in this, with some people saying that attention selects between incoming stimuli, and so you have attended stimuli and unattended stimuli, stuff you pay attention to, stuff you don't pay attention to. It's only stuff that you pay attention to that will end up being conscious. That's one story about this. And then you have this other story, D, which says, well, no, you have a phenomenal field around you, and some of that stuff is conscious, and some of that stuff just isn't there. Like in the change blindness example. It's out there, but it's not part of your phenomenal field because you don't see it. And amongst the stuff that you see, attention selects between stuff that needs to be worked on, amplified, stuff that is of interest to you, and stuff that remains unattended. So completely different stories. I don't know if this is going to work, but if you look at these two pictures, focusing on the red dot, you look at the left for a while, you take it in, and then you look at the right for a while, you take it in. They should look to you to be exactly the same. But they're completely different. They're completely different because this one is just made up of jumbled line segments and shapes. This one is a photograph. And they're built very carefully so as to reflect the properties of your visual system. And this is used to talk about what philosophers call the overflow argument. Is there more in your consciousness than you can report? We have the impression of perceiving everything in the visual world, but that's not the case. And as it turns out, as this demonstrates, a lot of it is just an illusion. You think you see everything, but in fact, you don't have access to all the stuff in the periphery. There's no color in the periphery. There's no detail. You think you see the details, but you really don't. All right. So, to summarize all of this, we know that the brain produces behavior, and we have a fairly good understanding of how the biology is connected to what we do. We also know that that same brain produces phenomenal experience, what it's like. But there's a sort of explanatory gap. We have no idea of how the biological activity of the brain produces what it's like, subjective experience. And that's the challenge for consciousness. Research. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about theories of consciousness. So there's a whole bunch of theories of consciousness. Anybody in this field has his own theory or her own theory of consciousness, and they're sort of all floating in space. This thing called global workspace theory, predictive processing, social theories of consciousness, information integration theory, higher order thoughts theory. And I think, well, that's the state of play. I was talking to one of the organizers and saying, wow, consciousness is so difficult to work with because you have no data, you have no theory. Well, yeah, okay, fine, it's true. There's too many theories and not enough data. I think there's a way of linking all of this, and I'll try to do that in the rest of the talk, so as to make them less incompatible as they may seem to be. There's even theories that assume that the whole universe is conscious. This is a respectable philosophical tradition called panpsychism. So they assume that every elementary particle in the universe carries some quantum of consciousness. And then to figure out why I'm conscious but not a table, given that every elementary particle is carrying some degree of consciousness, they have this combination problem, as they call it. I think this is not ridiculous, it's a respectable philosophical position. You can defend this. Spinoza defended it in some way, but it's very hard to figure out how to do that. So I'm inclined to be attracted by other sort of more mechanistic theories, and one of them was proposed by Dan Dennett. So for Dennett, consciousness is what he calls fame in the brain. He views the brain as a competitive system. Many different interpretations of stimuli are possible. They're always competing. One of them wins the competition, achieves fame in the brain, and that's what we're conscious of, and there's nothing else to explain. David Rosenthal, another American philosopher, has this other idea that consciousness involves what he calls higher order thoughts. What he calls higher order thoughts are representations or patterns of neural activity about other patterns of neural activity. And so he says a representation is a conscious representation when we have a higher order thought about that representation. So if I'm looking at my computer here, I have, there's a pattern of activity in my visual cortex. That's not conscious. It's only going to be a conscious visual representation if something in my prefrontal cortex says, aha, there's that familiar pattern of activity in my visual cortex. I call this a computer. That's when you're conscious. Completely different ideas. Fame in the brain, higher order thoughts. The best rendition of fame in the brain is Stan DeHaan's, who also spoke in Science and Cocktails at some point. And DeHaan says, well, the brain is made up of all these unconscious processing modules. You have a module for vision, many modules for vision, some for audition, some for action, some for smell, etc. They all do their work unconsciously, but they're all connected to this hub of high-level modules that are connected with each other. And once information gets in contact with that central hub, then it becomes globally available, it becomes conscious, it becomes famous in the brain. Because once it's in that hub, it can dominate processing elsewhere, and it becomes globally available. That's fame in the brain. Rosenthal's theory, it's a little harder to convey this graphically, so I made up something. But he says a mental state is conscious if we, as agents, are conscious of being in that mental state. We are conscious of being in a mental state when we have a thought that we are in that mental state. And so in sum, a mental state is a conscious mental state in virtue of having a high-order thought that you yourself are in that mental state. And this puts the subject back into the story. Frege said, it seems absurd to us that a pain, a mood, a wish should rove about the world without a bearer independently. An experience is impossible without an experient. The inner world presupposes the person whose inner world it is. And it's true that if you look at neuroscience research about consciousness, people often, well, they never talk about the subject. They're looking at slices of cortex and saying, what is the difference between a conscious and an unconscious mental representation? But we forget that nothing can be conscious unless there's somebody who's there to be the subject of those experiences. Very important point. So my own perspective on all this stuff, I call this the radical plasticity thesis, and the idea is that we begin with action, and then we assume that the brain continuously and unconsciously learns to redescribe its own activity to itself. So consciousness is something that the brain learns to do by redescribing its own activity to itself. And it does this by assessing the consequences of action in the brain itself, which I call the inner loop on the behavior, the action loop, and on the behavior of other people. And the three loops depend on each other, and so they form what the physicist Hofstadter called a strange loop. So, to put this claim even more provocatively, then, consciousness is the brain's non-conceptual theory about itself, which it has gained through experience interacting with itself, with the world, and with other people. And in that sense, it depends on the operation of unconscious prediction-driven learning mechanisms. You can think of it all as a form of inactive, non-conceptual, higher-order thought theory. So here's an example of these loops. The inner loop So the idea is that the brain predicts its own activity. And this is an experiment done with monkeys. They're trained to fixate across at the center of the screen and to saccade, so to move their eyes to a light that always comes up on the right side. So all they have to do is to learn to move their eyes, and then they get a reward. Now, on some trials, there's no light. So the fixation cross is there, then there's a beep, then they should move their eyes, they do, but there's no light. And what they did was to record from visual cortex using single-cell electrodes, so you can track the activity of a single neuron. And at the same time, they record the metabolism through the bulk signal, which you can get through an MRI scanner, so you measure how much oxygen is in the blood in visual cortex. And on the left side, there is a stimulus on the screen, so you can see the neurons firing at the bottom, and there's a corresponding or correlated modulation in the bulk signal. Those neurons require more oxygen because they're firing. On the right side, the stimulus isn't there, but the monkey expects it to be. So, because there's no stimulus, the neurons don't fire, but there still is a modulation in the bulk signal. This tells me that the brain actually anticipates the metabolic needs of regions of the brain that it thinks will be necessary for the next moment, basically. It already sends oxygenated blood to the visual cortex, which serves no purpose because there's nothing to process. But so these changes in metabolism reflect the anticipatory activity of the brain as it expects blood, oxygenated blood to be necessary in the visual cortex at that point in time. Here is an example of the action loop. So this is an experiment run by the social psychologist Fritz Strack. People have to judge how funny cartoons are. So I show you a crawl cartoon, and you know, some of these are really good, some of those are bad. You have a scale from 0 to 10. 0 is like, okay, what a shitty cartoon. 10 is like, wow, this one is really funny. And then there's a cover story to explain why people have to hold a pen in their mouth or between the upper lip and the nose. I won't get into that, but the point is that when people are made to judge those cartoons, holding a pen between their teeth, they judge the same cartoons to be funnier than the people who hold the pen between the upper lip and the nose. Now, why is that? Well, Strack's hypothesis, he calls this the facial feedback hypothesis, is that the state of your motor system, and in particular your facial muscles, influence perception. Why? Well, because when you hold a pen between your teeth, your facial muscles are put in the configuration they have when you smile. When you hold the pen between the upper lip and the nose, they're put in the configuration that they have when you feel disgust. So, your motor system influences your perception, right? The state of your facial muscles changes your perception. There was a big replication effort trying to do the same experiment that failed. So this experiment is a little bit questionable, maybe. I won't get into the details, but I think the hypothesis is true because here's this other stimulus we used in Brussels. These are again change blindness stimuli. So these actors' faces change over time. They go from neutral to anger or neutral to happiness. You can ask people to indicate the first time they see a change. And we did this with women participants, half of which had just undergone a Botox injection in their face, in the corrugator muscle, and half of them didn't. It turns out that the women who had just experienced the Botox injection in the corrugator muscles had more difficulty detecting anger than the control participants. Why? Well, for the same reason. To perceive an emotion, you have to be able to express it. When you have Botox in your corrugator muscle, you cannot be angry anymore. You can be angry, but you cannot express anger because your muscle is paralyzed. So the facial feedback hypothesis is probably true, and it shows that the state of your motor system influences your perception, so there's a loop there. Here's a third experiment. illustrating what I call the mind loop, that is the loop that exists between my mind and your mind. And this is again social psychologists, and it's a great experiment. There's also been some difficulty replicating this, but the story is still ongoing. And so this takes place in a lab's kitchen. Actually, it was their lab. And as in any lab's kitchen, there's a coffee machine and a fridge and a sink and stuff like that. And the coffee machine, well, you can just make a coffee, but then you're expected to leave a coin in a basket next to the coffee machine so that the staff can buy more coffee for next week. But this is voluntary, right? You don't have to put in a coin or anything like that. You do it if you want to, but of course you're expected to do it. And what they did was to change the poster that was taped on the fridge door, and on some weeks this poster was showing flowers, and on other weeks the poster was showing eyes. And the dependent measure is just great because it's how much money you find in the basket. And as it turns out, all the black dots are dots where you find more money, and those weeks are weeks where there was a poster showing eyes on the door of the fridge. Why is that? Well, because we adopt socially responsible behaviors when we have the feeling of being observed or in the presence of other people. In this case, you know, we put money in the basket. This is really cool, right? It shows that what we think other people may think of what we do changes what we do and the experience of what we do. So your mind is in my mind when I behave. And it changes if you're there or not, or if I'm primed with the idea that you may be there by these eyes on the fridge. It's just eyes on the fridge, right? But it still works. So all these loops, the brain is a loopy place, right? There's lots of stuff going on in the brain. And in all these cases, it's a story about a part of the system looking at itself, redescribing its own activity. How do we get there? Well, I think we get there by learning. This is why I think consciousness is something that the brain learns to do. There's lots of evidence of brain plasticity. Probably you all know the story about taxi drivers versus bus drivers. I'll tell it anyway. You look at the hippocampus using MRI. The hippocampus is this part of the brain that is responsible for spatial memory, the memory of the trajectory we take through cities. And you compare bus drivers and taxi drivers. They drive the same number of kilometers every day. But there's a big difference. The bus drivers keep driving the same roads. The taxi drivers, well, it's always a new problem. They have to figure out how to go from here to there, from Gare du Midi to ULB or whatever. Well, it turns out the hippocampus of taxi drivers is bigger than the hippocampus of bus drivers. And you don't need sophisticated methods, you know, just size it up, and it's actually bigger. There's more neurons. And there's more neurons the more the taxi driver has been driving. So people who have driven for 30 years as a taxi driver have an even bigger hippocampus than the people who have driven 5 years. Those are the results of experience actually getting into the biology of the brain. Another great example is the Halle-Berry neuron. So you work with patients awaiting surgery for an incurable epilepsy. If medication doesn't work, then those patients are put in the clinic, implanted with electrodes that record single-cell activity in their brain in those regions that the surgeon suspects may be responsible for the epilepsy crisis. And then they wait until they actually have a crisis, the electrodes can record, and so you can sort of circumscribe precisely which region of the brain needs to be removed so that the epilepsy is cured. And some of those patients work with cognitive neuroscientists, and in this experiment, what they did was just to show the patient hundreds of pictures. And they found, in one of those patients, one neuron who was only responding to pictures of Halle-Berry. In another patient, they found a Bill Clinton neuron. That guy had a neuron that would only fire when he was shown a picture of the American president, Bill Clinton. Now, this is great evidence for plasticity, massive plasticity in the brain, right? It turns out, in our brains, we have detectors that are incredibly high level, right? You have a neuron for your mother, you have a neuron for your father, you have a neuron for your boyfriend. It works with different pictures, it works with the name of Halle Berry, so it's a very high level, multimodal neuron, right? It's amazing. It's culture, well, I'm not sure if Halle Berry is culture, but anyway, it's culture getting into the biology of your brain. And the best example is this case of a 44-year-old patient in France, and he complains of weakness in his left leg. And so he goes see his neurologist, and history reveals that as an infant, he suffered from hydrocephalus, which is this condition where there's too much pressure in your brain ventricles, which contain liquid. And so these ventricles get bigger and bigger, this compresses the brain, your head actually gets larger, and so you're born with this big head. You can correct this by implanting a drain that makes it possible for this liquid to evacuate normally. And so this person was implanted with a drain as an infant. 14 years of age, the drain fails, he's operated on again. And then 30 years goes by, and this person has a normal life. He works, he has a family, he's not particularly bright, his IQ is 75, which is just below the normal range, but his verbal IQ is just above the normal range, 84, the lower line of the normal range. Anyway, this guy is clearly conscious, you know, integrated, works, and so on and so forth, and then they do a CT scan on this person's brain, and they see what you see on that picture. All the black is liquid. So this person is 44 years old, and his brain has this thin mantle of cortex near the skull and some subcortical structures. Massively different from our brains. Not all the neuronal bodies have died, so they're probably very much compressed, but we know that hydrocephalus destroys the connections between neurons. And anyway, this brain is completely different than any normal brain. That's a big challenge for any theory of consciousness that places a lot of weight on the integrity of certain anatomical structures. And then learning also changes what you feel. Here's my friend Barry Smith. He's a philosopher, and this guy has a great job. He's a philosopher in London, and his field is sensory experience. So as it turns out, what he's mostly interested in is the sensory experiences associated with wine drinking and whiskey drinking, etc. But he's an outstanding philosopher, but he gets to write these wonderful articles about those experiences. Think of the first time you had wine. It's a completely different experience than when, as Barry, you've become an expert enologist. Completely different experience. Expertise has enriched the contents of your consciousness. But it can also eliminate contents from consciousness, and so there's this little game, which we're not going to play, in which you read this text and I ask you to tell me how many instances of the letter F are in that little passage. We're not going to do it, but if you do it, I guarantee that you're going to miss a few. No matter how hard you try, you're going to miss a few. Why is that? Well, you're going to miss all the F's that are at the end of the function words, like off. Why is that the case? Because you're not reading those words. You're actually not reading those words. You're not reading those words because you don't need to read them in order to get the meaning. And so here, the fact that you're an expert in reading has eliminated contents from your consciousness. All right. So, 3 core ideas to close. Consciousness depends on what I call quality of representation. So the quality of what you see, basically. How is it visible, for instance? Can you perceive it clearly as the symbol is well defined? And I'm going to say this is important as a necessary condition for consciousness, but it's not sufficient. There's also this idea from Rosenthal that consciousness is also about redescribing your own representations. And this is what I call meta-representations. And then I'll say a few words and close with theory of mind, this mind loop, this idea that all minds is embedded or connected with the minds of other people. So first idea, quality of representation. I think that availability to form the contents of consciousness involves graded, continuous, and dynamic processes that depend on quality of representation, how strong a stimulus is, how stable in time it is, how distinctive it is. A good example of this is subliminal perception. We're all worried that, people show us stuff that make us do things while we're not seeing them. Stan DeHaan did a beautiful study about this, comparing the differences in brain activity between a situation where I show you a word on a screen and you see it, you can read it, and then I show you the same word, but so fast that you don't see it. So there's something on the screen, but it goes away too quickly, you can't read it. It turns out, if you image the brain in these two conditions, that you activate the left fusiform gyrus, which is specialized for processing the visual form of words, in both cases. But when you haven't seen the word consciously, you activate this region on the right side over there in red to a lesser extent than what is the case when the word was visible. But in addition to that, when you have seen the word, you can see that you ignite an entire network of other cortical areas because the word has been seen consciously. That's what he calls ignition of the global workspace, according to his theory. So that's the difference between conscious and unconscious processing, and that difference is related to the quality of the stimulus. That's not enough, I think. However, as this particular situation illustrates, there's a condition in which patients have lost, typically due to a vascular accident, both areas V1. Their entire occipital cortex. This turns out to be the first cortical relay for visual information. And so when you have lost your occipital cortex, you have the experience of being blind. And that's what these patients say. I'm blind. I cannot see anything anymore. I've become a blind person. Here is a blind sight patient who doesn't have any V1 left, who was tested by a colleague of mine, Beate Gelder. You can see the patient. He's the first person walking in this corridor here. So this person says he's blind. He had his accident 10 years ago when he was filmed here. But you can see him navigate this improvised obstacle course just as though he was sighted. How can this be with the person saying he doesn't see anything? So there's two things. One, this is access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness. The person doesn't feel like he's seeing anything anymore, but whatever visual information is still processed by his brain is sufficient to drive action in a manner that's appropriate to his goals. And so it illustrates this dissociation between access and phenomenal consciousness. I still wonder about what it is like for this person who says he's blind to be doing this, because I cannot imagine that he's just choosing randomly. It must feel like something to make those choices. It just doesn't feel like vision anymore for this patient. And that shows that quality of the stimulus is not sufficient. You also have this high order process, basically. What do you feel? One version of this is to say, well, you have noise and you have a signal, you have an obstacle in front of you or there's nothing, and this forms two distributions. So you can have an observing system then trying to figure out what these networks learn, and this can also be another neural network or another region of the brain producing judgments about what it is the first order network learns. I think these sorts of systems make it possible to figure out what is going on with mental attitude, the difference between an hallucination, something you hold to be true, something you hope, something you fear, something you desire, and so on and so forth. I think all of these require an observing system that qualifies the states of your brain. I think they also make it possible to anticipate, think of this inner loop, what's going on next. So this is one rendition of this. You have the brain learning about the world in the horizontal direction, and you have the brain learning about itself, doing something like signal detection on your own representations. There's a lot of work we've done on that. You can check out these articles if you're interested. Now I'm closing with theory of mind. Predicting the world is easy, right? We all know what's going to happen. Oh, we have a fairly good idea of what's going to happen when this glass hits the bottom. But predicting what we do, well, that's also relatively easy. I know that if I click on this button, the line is going to come up. Mastery of sensory motor contingencies. What is really hard is figuring out the consequences of the actions I direct towards other people, because they have unobservable states. They have unobservable mental states. And so I don't know what's going to happen if I do something to you. If I smile to you, you may smile back to me, but maybe not. If I meet you on a morning when you're unhappy, I don't know either. And so this is the way I think this works. And I call this being virtual. I'm directing actions towards other people, and I perceive their reactions, which makes it possible, if I'm endowed with learning mechanisms, to come to progressively be able to predict what's going to happen as a result of my action. And this requires some inference about the mental states of other people. And the claim is that I can take that as a model of myself. I get those internal states that I cannot see in other people, but in doing that, I'm building a model of what it's like to be a person, which I can then use to understand myself. And I do this with everybody I meet in my entire existence. And now I have this model of what it's like to be a person. And that model can help me redescribe my own activity to myself. That's basically the main idea. All right, conclusions. I think the brain continuously and unconsciously learns about the world by anticipating the consequences of action. It learns about itself by learning about the consequences of activity in one region on activity in other regions, and it learns about other people by building models of their mental states based on assessing the consequences of action on their behavior. Others act as external selves during cognitive development. So this is the inactive view turned both inwards and further outwards, and in that sense, consciousness is the brain's unconscious, enacted, embodied theory about itself. Consciousness is something that the brain learns to do, because what would be the point of doing anything if the doing wasn't doing something to you, right? What would be the point of doing anything if the doing wasn't something to you? Conscious agents like we are care about their experiences in a way that zombies do not, or machines for that matter. And so in that sense, consciousness is a sort of mind currency. We seek pleasurable experiences, we attempt to avoid painful ones, and we couldn't do that if we were not conscious of our own mental states. Dennett nails it again when he says the challenge is to understand how do we go from doing things for reasons to having reasons for doing things. The plant I showed you, which closes its leaves to capture an insect, is doing this for good evolutionary reasons. It provides it with an advantage. But those reasons are not the plant's own reasons. And that explains why the plant has no agency. That explains why the plant has no consciousness. we have reasons of our own, because we are conscious agents, for doing the things that we do. And that's a major difference. So who is conscious? Well, three possibilities, or three ideas. I think we need massive information processing resources that are sufficiently powerful to simulate certain aspects of their own physical basis. We need continuous learning systems that attempt to predict future states, and we need immersion. And this is crucial in a sufficiently rich social environment from which models of yourself can be built. All right, this is the end. I just want to show you a clip that shows how the work we do is just great. That clip comes from a movie, which you can see on Netflix, called The Most Unknown, and it's about the big questions: origins of life, universe, consciousness. And here's my friend Davide D'Angelo, who's a dark matter physicist who visited my laboratory. It's also going to be shown at ULB free on the 7th, if you like.
I think this laboratory is doing really interesting things. I mean, it's going to very basic questions about what actually is the definition of consciousness, of self-awareness. I never knew that there was somebody tackling these questions from with a real experimental point of view. So this is far more experimental than I expected. I say, okay, these guys are psychologists, they're going to talk all the time, and that will be it. That's not the case. I mean, they have hardware, they perform measurements, they discuss data, so it's... I think we're on the same page with Axel, I mean, really.
All right, cool. This is my lab. All at work. Some of them may be here, I don't know. But they've all contributed to this, to the work we're doing. And, well, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.